Well, good morning, Westbrook. I hope that you guys are having a fantastic Sunday morning. Now, we're past Easter, so we're going to switch back into where we were before all of this COVID stuff started and the video series started, which was we were doing a series on James. We had just started a series on James. And I'd like to get back to that, and hopefully we won't be like we were in Ephesians. Maybe 3 years later we'll finish, but I think we can do it at least in half the time that it took us to get through Ephesians. I think I've gained more experience, and I'm able to understand how quickly and easily you can get bogged down in a New Testament letter. So, James. Now, first off, we're going to need a recap. It's been a while since we've been in James, and it's a heavy book, to say the least. There's a lot of theological questions. There's a lot of interpretive questions. It's kind of just across the board. It's something that we need to spend a lot of time thinking very seriously about how we approach. And I think that it's important to get a good picture of what James is as a whole before we get into the small pieces of it like we do in a normal teaching. So, I want to encourage you to go back to the Bible Project video that we showed in the first sermon, and it'll be in a card or one of those little links above in the YouTube video. And I would just recommend that you watch through that overview and background video that they do, because it's fantastic, and I think they do a really good job. I said fantastic twice because it's that good. And just get your bearings about what James is about, the message of James, what James's style is, all that sort of stuff. Now, last time we talked about James 1-5-9. And the point was basically that James was literally commanding his readers to ask for wisdom from God so that they could persevere through trials and become more mature, basically. Become the words like telos, which is like perfect, complete. Kind of as a throwback to what we were talking about for the past few Sundays with Sabbath and perfection and all that stuff. So basically James's whole point in 1-5-9 was a command. So he was commanding his readers, the big Jewish Christian church, to ask God for wisdom about how to deal with difficult things that they might be facing. And we also talked about James's style a bit. And I want to go back to that because I think it's really important. So, first off, he's very, very Jewish. He ruminates on an idea or a doctrine, and he comes back to it. He circles around, and then you'll see him come back and throw all these different things together from a new angle in a different part of the book. And basically everything is interrelated. I think that's the best way to think about James. If you can see some sort of connection between one thing that he said in chapter 1 and something that he said maybe in chapter 2, there's a good chance that they are connected in some way. And it's really important to understand that. And this means that we need to take the surrounding context of the passages before and after in the text that we're looking at very, very seriously. I don't think that we can get a full picture of what he means in even our passage today without understanding everything that went before it and where he's going and what comes after it and all that sort of stuff. It's really, really important. And like I said last time that we talked about James, we need to be asking ourselves when we look through each of these verses and these passages, what's the connection between what came before and what is after, basically? And if we're asking that, I think we'll do a good job. Another thing I wanted to emphasize about James's style is that he follows very closely after the teachings and style of Jesus. He constantly refers back to Jesus' teaching and is alluding to it throughout his letter. But he also kind of takes this paradigm that Jesus teaches through and uses it himself. Where basically Jesus, he would when he was giving moral instruction, he would often teach this kind of concept that identity equals behavior. And this actually, what Jesus does actually kicks off the fundamental paradigm for moral teaching, even in Paul, in James, and Hebrew, all over the place. And if we want to think about it this way, in more of Jesus's language, like an apprentice of Jesus or disciple of Jesus, equals that you act like an apprentice or a disciple of Jesus. If you want to think about it even in a more modern day alliteration, a construction worker does construction work. Think about it that way. That's the way that Jesus taught morals, that identity equaled behavior. And James carries this forward, and this is going to be really important for our text today. And another thing that we need to pay attention to is that if we want to try and make sense of something that Jesus is saying, there's a good chance that he's probably alluding back to something that Jesus said. And it makes sense. I mean, many people think that the James that wrote this book, this letter, is James, the brother of Jesus. So his big brother, James's big brother, is also his Lord and Savior and his teacher. And so, of course, he has kind of an interesting characteristic or quality behind what he teaches and how he led the church and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, he's probably alluding back to Jesus, and I think that that's going to be really significant for us today. Another thing that I touched on last time we talked about James too was that James is a really harsh and challenging book sometimes. And I'm just being honest from my own experience that when I started reading James, when I first came to follow God, and I remember that I felt like whenever I read James, I didn't make the cut. That I was like not a real Christian because I wasn't doing everything that James says I should be doing. And that I wasn't good enough. That was kind of the sense that I always came away from this book with. And I think that's deeply flawed. But this was only kind of made more intense when I became more deeply acquainted with like Protestant evangelical ways of thinking about salvation and everything. I kind of just thought that James was a total legalist. I thought that he had no concept of grace. He had no concept of salvation through grace by faith, or by grace through faith. Get the prepositions right in that sentence. But I just couldn't. I came away always feeling like, man, like what do I do with this book? And I read the famous passage where James talks about faith with works, and it just didn't compute. And eventually I just kind of said to myself, I think I'm probably deeply misunderstanding James here, and I'm just going to think about it later. So lo and behold, we come to the series this time around at this point in time in 2019, 2020. And it's time to dig through those misconceptions and figure out what James is really saying, and whether he's talking about whether he is really being legalistic or not. And I believe firmly that he's not. So as I've dug into this whole discussion, I've learned a lot about, like I said, my own misconceptions about James, and realized that there's a lot more to the picture, and that James is thinking in just totally different categories than Paul to a certain extent. Or he's just approaching things with different terminology. I think that might be the better way to put it. And I don't want to get into too much of this right now because we'll dig into this fully and as much as we can in chapter 2. But what I want to say is that I don't think that James was writing to make people feel spiritually insecure and inadequate, and that or give them a sense of hopelessness. I just can't. The more that I've studied the book, and we'll talk about this more later, I just don't see that being the case at all. It just doesn't line up with what's really happening in the book and the point of a book to begin with in the Bible. So, if anything, I think that James is writing with the assumption that his people, the people that he's writing to, are genuine followers of Jesus. His primary concern, if we see the first thing that he talks about in this letter that we talked about a few sermons into the series, is that he feels this need, that he needs to encourage and challenge his people to become more mature. Really, that's what his concern is. It's not about telling everybody, oh, you're not good enough, you're not a Christian, get out of here, you're not saved, whatever. He wants to challenge the people in his congregations, his people, to be more mature and to grow up, basically. And I think that one of the reasons why he's doing this goes into the background, in that there's a large group of the people that he's writing to that are really struggling, and they're going through difficult things. And he's concerned that this is going to pull away or harm their faith. It's gonna draw them away from Jesus instead of towards Jesus. And so that's where his urgency is coming from. That he's worried that people might be slipping away a little bit, and he's serious about that. But he's not saying, "Oh, you're not good enough." He's saying, let's really, you really need to think seriously. We really need to continue to grow and to mature. This is really important that we grow through these trials that we might be facing, instead of letting them defeat us and defeat our faith. I think that's a better way to look at what James is doing. So is James really intense and super challenging? Absolutely. He's intense because he wants to communicate how important it is that the people in his churches continue to grow in wisdom and become more mature. For James, you need to be willing to grow up and become a full-grown follower of Jesus. That's what he cares about. Are you willing to grow? It's not about whether you can grow or will grow or anything like that. He knows that stuff's going to get taken care of. It's just whether you actually want to grow. And I think that that's ultimately where we see a lot of the grace that seems to be lacking in this book is kind of in what seems to be his assumptions that he's bringing to his audience, to the people that he's writing to. That he assumes that they know God, that they're following God. He's just worried that something's going to derail their faith, and he's worried that they are settling for less than they should be, I think. So, let's talk about the passage that we're going to talk about now. So like I said, last time we talked about we talked 1:4 to 7, or 4 to 8. And so we're going to move on to the next chunk, which is 1:9 to 11. And so I'm going to read that now. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant, its blossom fails, and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. So, nice, light, easy passage, right? No, of course not. This is James we're talking about here. First off, you know me, I like to get into some context before we actually dig into the text and what it means and all that different stuff. So let's get into that now. So in terms of literary context, so, just the stuff in the actual book, like what goes before and after in this passage and all that. James has been talking since 1 verse 2 about dealing with various challenges or trials. Devastating, maybe even life-threatening, financially difficult times or situations that many of his people might be facing. Probably because they've become Christian. But this discussion about perseverance is actually, there's something going on beneath that, and we need to be aware of that. He's worried that these difficult circumstances are undermining the assurance that these believers, his people, have about their identity as followers of Jesus. He's worried that these difficult circumstances are undermining their ability to live well and live as mature people in the family of God. So he commands his readers to ask God for wisdom about who they are and how to navigate the difficult situations they find themselves in. In 1:9, where it says, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, he starts to talk about how this wisdom in relation to a specific circumstance. So one of the many difficult situations that these Jewish Christians, which we'll talk about in a sec, are facing is that maybe some of them are really struggling financially and are dealing with poverty. There's a lot to say about that, and James will talk a lot about wealth throughout the rest of the book. But in this case, what he's concerned about is that they have the wisdom to navigate the difficulty of being impoverished and come to God and find God in that, and vice versa, that the wealthy seek wisdom about their wealth, which we'll talk about too. But let's talk about the historical context that relates to 1:9 to 11. And what we're seeing here isn't, it's not like kind of envy of wealth that we're used to in our contemporary situation, our current situation, our culture. If you were rich in the Greco-Roman world, it was because you were lucky enough to be a successful merchant, maybe, or because you were part of the ruling class, that you were at a higher class than other people. And we have less of a sense of that in our kind of capitalist, democratic societies that we live in. It's hard for us to imagine looking at a person and thinking that person was born better than me or born to rule over me. Being that we're democratic, we believe that the populace has the right to rule, and being that we're capitalist, we believe that everybody should have the right to make a living and to thrive and to prosper and to make a buck, right? That's our culture here. And that's not the culture of the people that James is writing to at all. We might envy those who are wealthier than us because they're more comfortable and more able to do what they want. But at least in my experience, I don't look at those who are wealthier than me as inherently above me or in a higher rigid class. That they just being born into that family have the right to rule over me. Or be wealthy and have a lot of land, whatever. But the Greco-Roman world, like I said, is different. The wealthy were wealthy because they were born into the right class and the right family. And class ruled everything. And this might not have been the case as much with Jews, but Jews even had their own issues with wealth, as we'll talk about. So imagine the situation this way. In the churches that James James is thinking about and writing to. Imagine that there are wealthy Jewish Christians that are coming and worshiping with poor Jewish Christians in these little messianic Christian communities. And imagine that they're coming together and they're doing what the original church did, which was have a communal meal and worship and sing songs and get teachings while they're in this meal together. And the thing that we need to understand about is that even in this, class was a huge issue with that sort of thing. For us, it's not such a big deal to go and eat dinner with somebody that's a millionaire. If you're not a millionaire, maybe they might buy, or maybe there's some expectations about that. But in general, you wouldn't go into that sort of situation thinking, they're above me, I shouldn't eat with them. But in the Greco-Roman world, that's kind of the way that they thought. In fact, there was a saying in the period where the New Testament was written, where amongst Greek people, where they said that you only eat with your equals. And so imagine Jesus rolls in and just totally throws down all these social divisions and these class structures, and rich people are eating with poor people, Gentiles are eating with Jews, and all this different stuff. It would be deeply and utterly scandalous. But you would also be forced into situations where you're keenly aware of differences, because you're just not used to being around people that were before in a different class than you. So these communities of believers would need to let go of all of that classism that they were deeply conditioned into. They would be deeply conditioned to look at each other along the prescribed lines of the wealthy person is just better than the poor person. So imagine kind of the things going through your mind if you're on one side or the other of that equation when you're coming to sit down and eat with someone that you're considering now your brother or your sister. It would be like you're in a time warp or some sort of strange different reality. And just think about the implications of what James is saying into this situation about wealth in 1:9-11. He's offering wisdom that the poor should have pride and the rich should be humble. This is just super countercultural. But let's get into the text. So the question that I have is, after having kind of thought through the context, is on what basis can James say that being poor is better than being rich? Why is he saying that that's the case? He says, I'll read this again, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation. So the status quo in the Greco-Roman culture is the opposite. The rich should be proud, the poor should be humble. But James is saying the opposite thing. And I think that the answer to this is tied into the teachings of Jesus on wealth. James, being a keen student of potentially his big brother Jesus, was very skeptical of wealth, just like Jesus was, especially in the terms that they thought about it back then, with all the class and the idolatry associated with wealth. There are many cases where James is referring to Jesus in his teachings on wealth, and this is one of them. And in this case, he's referring to the place where Jesus indicates that the idolatrous pursuit of wealth, I'll say that again, the idolatrous pursuit of wealth will blind people to what's really important, like following Jesus, joining a spiritual family. Let me reiterate that. He's referring to the places where Jesus indicates that the idolatrous pursuit of wealth will blind people to what's really important. So, furthermore, Jesus also teaches about how greed and hoarding of wealth can blind us to the needs of others, especially the poor. Think about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man basically lets poor Lazarus die of starvation while he feasts. And the rich man was so obsessed with accruing wealth and living with all the comfort that this wealth afforded that he lost sight of the humanity of another person and let that person die on his doorstep or at the gate of the city, or maybe the gate of his household. The other side, and so that's bad enough, but the other side of this is, especially in the teachings of Jesus, is that Jesus sees the poor and those who don't worship wealth at an advantage in terms of being able to follow him and live well and please God with their lives. So think about the classic kind of story where there's this young rich ruler guy that shows up and says, Jesus, I'm going to follow you. And Jesus kind of asks him about whether he's followed the law and all this different stuff. He's basically just setting him up. And this guy shows up thinking that Jesus is going to be impressed with him because he's the poster child for being a blessed, successful Jew. He's wealthy. He's kept the 10 Commandments his whole life. I mean, in their kind of mindset, the Jewish mindset at that point, in many circles, he would be like top of the barrel, like top tier stuff here. And Jesus' response is fascinating in this context, because his response or his request is that this rich man give up all of his wealth and all of his privilege that he's obviously idolizing to help the poor. See the connections here with James and what we're talking about here? And I think what we see even in that story is that the wealth was blind. His wealth and his idolatry of his wealth, his obsession with his wealth, was blinding this young wealthy man from the needs of others and his own spiritual needs. Keeping his wealth seemed more important to him than the kingdom of God and the needs of others. And so here's the point, especially with what James is saying, is basically, if we think about the way that Jesus talks about wealth, he's basically saying, both James and Jesus are saying that those who are struggling financially actually have a spiritual advantage over the wealthy in a lot of ways. They might feel that they are worthless or destitute by the standard of the culture that's around them. But to James, they are the most free to follow God without the seductive and blinding power that wealth can have. They can see their obvious need of God to help them and provide for them, when the wealthy can be tricked into feeling they need nothing from God, basically. And more than that, they can be tricked by their greed into forgetting the needs of others and forgetting the humanity of others. So, into this context, the wisdom that James is offering to his people is that being in humble circumstances actually affords them, this is the wisdom that he's referring to, is that being in this humble circumstance affords them the ability to have, to see what's really important, to have perspective, and it pushes them to be reliant on God in a way that their wealthier brothers and sisters would potentially struggle with. And we need to keep in mind that James doesn't care about wealth. He's following the footsteps potentially of his bigger brother, Jesus, our Lord and Savior. Right? It's crazy to think about, but if he's really taking Jesus seriously, he knows Jesus didn't care really about wealth. He cared about coming and bringing liberation and freedom and healing and redemption and salvation and rescue to humanity, and that he promised the return of a reality in his coming, his second coming, of something far better than any sort of wealth could ever offer us now. So really, wealth has different kind of value for James. It has value for what it can facilitate in terms of the works of the kingdom, and I don't think that James wants everybody to be poor and destitute, But we have to remember that he's offering wisdom. He's taking wisdom and he's putting it right in our face very assertively. And he's saying that we need to be really careful about where our hearts and our minds are at with wealth. And to get into the application side of this, I understand that you, just like I, am probably feeling a bit grated by what James is saying. We live in a materialist culture that values wealth. I feel safe in saying that idolizes wealth. We love the comfort that our wealth can bring us. And the truth is that relative to a lot of the world, we have a lot of wealth. And I think maybe the old school way of thinking that I had about James would make me feel like James is saying, oh, because you have this wealth, you're not going to be able to be a Christian, or you're a very bad one at the least. And that's not what James is saying. I don't think that James is putting a ban on wealth for followers of Jesus. James never says anything like that, and if you really pay attention to what Jesus says, he doesn't say that either. Rather, just like I've said before, he's intentionally being abrasive and challenging because he wants to encourage both the poor and wealthy alike. He's acknowledging that they exist. And he's not saying that they shouldn't. He's encouraging them to grow in wisdom and become more mature members of Jesus' spiritual family. That's what James cares about. He doesn't care about how rich you are. He doesn't care. He wants you to grow. That's what his concern is here. And so he offers a challenge to the poor to look beyond their cultural understanding of poverty, to elevate themselves in their identity in Jesus and as a member of Jesus' family. And understand that these humble circumstances actually offer them spiritual advantages, where they can see what's really important and they can learn, well, they necessarily need to rely on God more. And that's a good thing. And he also, on the other side of this, challenges the rich to see their wealth for what it is. It's not something that they should rely on, and it's something that can blind them from the needs of others and ultimately hold them back from following Jesus if they don't watch where their hearts are at. And so, imagine going back to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, if you're saying, kind of tying two analogies together in a really crude way, but he's kind of saying, can you Jewish Christians be like the rich man sometimes? If you're wealthy, do you think that that's more important than following God? And what does it mean to put following God over wealth? Now, that's not something that I can tell you what to do. I think only God can tell you what to do, either in maybe difficult financial situation you find yourself in, or in abundance. I think that the challenge is that you actually take seriously the need to ask God for wisdom, like he says earlier in this chapter. Ask God for wisdom about what to do about your financial position. And I think in a more kind of relevant way, thinking about all of this COVID-19 situation, I think that there's also a challenge there too. As a caveat, I'll just say that I want to be very sensitive about this and careful about how I say this. But for those who are struggling financially in this kind of situation that we're in right now, it's crazy. But I think that this passage is a reminder to turn to God instead of to envy. And it's a challenge, actually, to do that. It's a challenge to turn to God to give you wisdom about how to navigate your situation that you might find yourself in now, and to ask God to provide a way to make a living, to get through this tough time. And I say this fully understanding how difficult the situation may be for some. And I'm not trying to suggest that this isn't difficult or painful, but And I'm not trying to undervalue the struggles that you might be going through. What I am suggesting is that being in a humble circumstance because of this virus can make us keenly aware of our need to rely on God and actually teach us what's really important. And I think that those are lessons that we can relish in this situation. We can learn about what's really valuable, and maybe if we put our perspective on that instead of how much we're lacking and we're struggling, that can help us get through this. And I think that if we let it, we can let this situation bring us closer to God and turn us to God in our need. Again, I understand that it's difficult. But for those with wealth, I think the challenge is obviously way more intense. And it's something that we should think very seriously about. And what I think James is saying, even to our COVID-19 situation now, is that we need to think really seriously about whether we're putting our own comfort, wants, and desires above the immediate needs of others. If we have wealth, we need to be thinking seriously about whether it's seducing us into kind of idolatry, into greed, and whether we're relying on it instead of God. And I don't know what that means specifically for any of you that are watching this. And I think the ultimate challenge is that you would actually go to God and ask for wisdom about that and what to do with the wealth that you do have. And he could draw you into any number of things, and that's fine. Or he could say, keep on doing what you're doing, and that's also good too, I think. And just as a reiteration, the challenge, it's a challenge. We need to remember that there's grace in this challenge to grow, and that there's an acknowledgement that there is areas where we need to grow, and that there's grace for that, and that it's just the matter of whether we are willing to grow in these things. And like I said, James is super intense, and every time you open it and really every time you go deep into these sayings and these teachings of James, you're naturally and you should really feel challenged, and I think that that's a good thing. If our faith is as comfortable as it can be sometimes, I think that we should really think about that and why that is the case and whether that's a good thing or not. And the truth is that I think as believers we always could probably use a reminder here or there about where God might want to grow us. And that's not to say that he won't help us along the way. He absolutely will. But it's a reminder that if we're gonna live and we're gonna claim that we follow Jesus and that we're a part of his family, that means something for the way that we live our lives, and because that means something in the way that we represent Jesus to other people. And in particular, if there's some level of corruption around the way that we deal with wealth, we need to think seriously about that and get that in the open and make the changes that we need to, so that we can really, I guess, be the salt and light, like Jesus says, right? So super challenging, and I am not void of this. I'm not free from the challenge that James is offering here. This has made me think very seriously about my own life and my own financial situation, and there's a lot that we all need to pray about. Yeah. So let's pray. Father, I just thank you so much for just each and every person in our little family here, and for those that are watching in the extended family. I pray that you bless everyone, and that you bless them through this challenge of James, and be with them and be with us all as we navigate this difficult situation that we're in. And I pray that you provide for us in the way that we need, and help us to be of help to those that are in need in whatever way that looks like. Give us wisdom about that and show us what to do, and guide us, Lord. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Thanks for watching. Connect with us on Facebook or YouTube with the link in the description below. Stay tuned for more remote and connected video sermons dropped every Sunday on the Westbrook Community Church Facebook page and YouTube channel. Have a good week and God bless.